Well, would you agree that taxes matter? Well, have you heard that taxes actually make up the largest part of your personal budget? So let's get to talk about taxes today. So lean in. You're going to want to hear my next guest, Mr. Kim Moody.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So with me here today to talk about all things tax, as we talk about this important policy area, is Kim Moody. He's the founder of Moody Tax, and he's also the former chair of the Canadian Tax Foundation. A warm welcome to you, Kim Moody.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Kim, I'm really excited about our conversation about tax policy. It's such an important policy area, and I certainly admire your analysis and where you're coming from. But I wanted to cover a few basic things before we kind of dive into this topic a little bit more. And I do this as a lay person as much as I pay attention to tax policy. But it just help us with a basic insight. If you tax something, you get something less. Is that correct? And if you is that kind of the basic principle of tax policy?
Well, for sure. I mean, a tax is a depletion of wealth, just like a gift is a depletion of wealth, right? By definition. So the bottom line is
Hmm.
a tax is not a solution for everything. Of course, it's a necessity for, the price we pay for a stable and good government, with
Hmm.
infrastructure and providing for the poor, et cetera. But
Hmm.
by definition, it means you're paying for it and you're less wealthy. So there's a balancing act.
Exactly. Yeah, it strikes me that in the field of so many areas of policy, we need kind of a Goldilocks solution. We don't want too much or too little, but we kind of want that balanced approach. And it just
Absolutely.
strikes me as a very interesting principle that if you tax something, you get less of it that you're taxing. And so if you tax, well, what is it, income, you basically get less work or people try to avoid taxes. So tax policies is really quite, it's funny that I know that in some of your writings, Kim, you've said that tax policy is a bit like wine and cheese in the sense that tax policy is a bit like politics and policy at the same time. So what did you mean by that?
Well, it, it's interesting. When I first, I was having a chat with a buddy of mine yesterday, as a matter of fact, and we're both tax practitioners, and we've been around for about 30 years, and we're both I like to think that we're smart people, and and we were saying, in the last 10, 12, 15 years, so call it half of our careers, half of our time has been advocating for good tax policy. And
Hmm.
part of that advocation involves an understanding of politics. Well, I mean, I minored a bit in political science, not formally, but I took a lot of
Hmm.
political science courses in my undergrad. Did I think that I was going to use some of that background and knowledge in order to advocate for good tax policy? No, I didn't. I learned the hard way that tax policy and politics are inextricably linked, like wine and cheese. And so
Hmm.
whenever I lecture a lot or get invited to lecture about tax policy, I always put the premise up, hey, I'm happy to lecture on this, but if you want somebody that's not going to talk, and lean into a little bit of politics, then you got the wrong guy because they're
Hmm.
inextricably linked.
But it is very interesting because if you look at the bigger picture, tax policy does matter. If you look at it from a nonpartisan way, how you tax people has a direct impact on their quality of life, how much money they have to look after their children or look to their future in terms of their retirement. And it relates to the quality of life in our country, Canada. So tax policy really affects us from beginning A to Z. And so I'm really delighted we can have this conversation. So I want to just step back for a bigger picture moment. And if you got everybody out of the metaphorical pool and you ask the question, how much tax should you pay Do you have kind of a principled answer on that? Like, I think of all kinds of thinkers throughout history that kind of gave a response. I think of John Maynard Keynes, a great economist who kind of led the way for a bigger state. And if memory serves me correctly, he said that, well, you probably shouldn't pay much more than 20% of your income to the government. So, what do you think?
Well, there's a long answer to this. I'll try to keep it tight. It depends on what you're taxing. I happen to think, just based upon my experience and watching taxpayer behaviors over the year, that 50% is that number in Canada, at
Hmm.
least anyhow, on income.
Hmm.
There's a lot of other measures like sales taxes. I don't have a great answer for you, but I think on income, 50%, which I still think is egregiously high. I think a
Hmm.
fair number is somewhere in the mid 40s, because that compares nicely around the world. But I think 50% is anything in addition, in excess of that, like Ontario, BC, the Atlantic provinces, and Quebec has right now. It's a real drag on productivity. It's a real drag on people's incentives to start a business, to invest capital, et cetera, et cetera.
Is that what's happened in Canada the last 10 years? Is we've seen hundreds of billions of dollars leave this country. We are not seen as a place to invest money for business, sadly. So, how does that impact our lives? Why should we care about that?
Well, I've rang this alarm bell for a lot of years, and I always get dismissed by left of center academics and certainly left of center politicians. But I'll give you an example. I've been practicing tax only for about 30 years. In the last 9 years since Trudeau came to government, his first action was to increase personal tax rates, and that caused a real ripple amongst entrepreneurs and high income earners, whether they're
Mm-hmm.
employees or not. Fast forward to all the other measures, and there's a long list of measures that have specifically targeted entrepreneurs, and they're not good measures, they're negative measures.
Mm-hmm.
The first 23 years of my practice, I did maybe a dozen, I worked on a dozen files that involved Canada or Canadians leaving Canada. I call those departure
Mm-hmm.
tax files because when you leave Canada, you're deemed to have disposed of your assets at fair market value. There's some
Mm-hmm.
exceptions to that broad-based rule, but most of those dozen files in my first 23 years were involving lifestyle. They wanted to, grandma, grandpa wanted to live in Florida or something like that, right? It had
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with tax. But of course, the tax people, me and the team, my team needed to be involved. Do you want to take a guess at how many files we've worked on?
50?
Try again.
200?
Multiply that by three.
Oh my. That,
600 files that we've worked on. Now, to be fair, not all those 600 have closed. In other words, not all of them have left,
mm-hmm.
but about half of them have closed. And the wealth attached to those 300 files is billions of dollars. And so
Wow.
what I
So
lecture to
you're
some of my
so just to hold on. So you're
sure,
saying that you can basically track the tax policies that have been made the last 10 years to the substantial increase in files of people, Canadians, hardworking Canadians, entrepreneurs who said, I'm going to leave this country. I'm going to pack up and I'm going to move to where is it? Usually in the United States. Is that
it's
right?
usually the United States. About 95% of the cases involve the United States because the culture is similar, the language is similar, the
Hmm.
economy is strong. Forget about political leadership. I mean, that's the standard thing I get. Oh, but what about the politics down there? What about the healthcare? All
Hmm.
those are resolvable. It's
Hmm.
it's the
Okay,
tax
but
policies are
this is
pushing
a
these people.
a really sad story because
It is.
basically because of bad public policy, we're pushing that unique class of creators, namely, I assume, entrepreneurs who are looking for greener pastures, pardon me, because they want to pay a lower tax so they can build their lives, and they're making a difficult decision. It's not an easy one to leave a
No,
country, to pick
no.
up stakes and leave. So they're leaving the country, and all of us are kind of, well, are we better off for it or poorer off?
Well, there's an easy answer to that, and the answer is no. So what I always lecture to, especially law students, when I get invited to speak to the faculty at various, various schools or to business schools, I say, how many of you think you should tax the rich more? And of course, especially in law schools, the hands tend to
Hmm.
go up.
Hmm.
Um, and then I say, okay, let's pretend that one entrepreneur, and let's say that entrepreneur is in the top 0.1% of income in Canada. It's actually a little
Hmm.
less than that. Let's say they have $10 million of income. And let's just say that their average tax rate, let's keep it low and say it's 50% on that 10 million. So that's $5 million of tax that's going to the federal and provincial government. How many new Canadians or how many existing Canadians do you have to replace that lost 5 million if they leave Canada? Just think about that.
Mm. Wow.
And you can actually put some precision around that number, but let's just say it's a ton. Can you deal with that challenge easily? No, you can't. You can't.
Wow.
And when you have 300 of these types of people, not all of them earning 10 million, of course, but that are leaving Canada, that's a real problem.
Okay, so basically, tax policy matters because otherwise we're choosing as a nation to drive out really an entrepreneurial class of people that are arguably creating jobs and a brighter future for everyone. And so
Yes.
this is kind of a dead end, isn't it, for our country?
Well, it's a dead end if you don't deal with it, right? That's why,
Hmm.
politics, uh, enters the equation, and you need politicians who understand this,
Hmm.
both at the individual level and the party level, and can fight and advocate for policies that are good for the whole. I mean, one of the things that Canada
Hmm.
needs, and I think we're going to talk about this, is just tax reform, tax review, and
Yeah, indeed.
which
Yes.
includes tax reductions. So, in any event,
Right. So, Kim, I guess if we move beyond public policy, I suppose part of the question that I hear from so many Canadians is really a kind of a sense of moral principle. Surely we run into kind of the area of moral discussion because at what point does it make sense for someone to work really hard and then to have a third party come in, namely the government, and use in effect the force of law to take the earnings that I work so hard to remove from me so that I can't, like, if you're taxing somebody well over 40% or 30%, I mean, that's a large part of your income. What moral authority do people have, including the state, to take that money from me?
well, that's a tough question to answer, right? I mean, I do believe that societies need to collect income in order to pay for necessary
Hmm.
infrastructure and safety nets. So, do I think the price of that is taxes? Sure, but at some point, there's got to. It's like what we talked about early on. It's a balancing act, and it's
Indeed.
Goldilocks principle, right?
Hmm.
Is it just right? Well, that's what you pay good public policy people to
Hmm.
try to advocate for you, right? I'm not a public policy expert. I'm a common sense guy,
Hmm.
and I analyze my client base and the people that are around
Hmm.
me, and I look at bad public policy driving poor behavior. It's dangerous.
No, I'm with you. So, surely some of the hallmarks of good tax policy would include transparency, simplicity, the ease of administration, and at the right level, so it's actually an incentive for people to work. Would those be the key policies in your mind? The key principles that would guide good public policy when it comes to tax?
For sure. But transparency, I think, is one of the key ones. And I wrote an article on this in the Post probably about a year or so ago. And I've been, and maybe it's my naivety because I've never worked in government, but right now in Canada, the development of tax policy is, it's the domain of the Department of Finance, both politically and at the bureaucrat level.
Hmm.
And of course, lately it's mainly politically. I really would like to see a more transparent and open system where the development of tax policy is, you know, there's a so-called think tank that's put together, which involves government, which involves politicians, entrepreneurs, regular folks in Canada, academics, go down the list. and then they come up with good policies that are then, the politicians can then pick and choose in those policies, but at least there's transparency. Whereas right
Right.
now, the development of tax policy it's not transparent. It's all developed internally, which I don't like
So
that.
that I think you make a very good point, Kim. So with that lack of transparency, does that not create kind of a sense of distrust in the system? Like I hear from
Oh,
so
very
many
much
people
so.
say, "Gosh, the tax system is so complicated. I can barely even complete my own return." It creates a huge industry, including your own, of specialists. I mean, are there really any Canadians who really understand the existing tax system?
Not a chance. Not a chance. I mean, I've been in this game a long time. The complexity has grown to the point where, I mean, here's the Income Tax Act sitting on the end of my desk here, right?
Wow.
You can see how thick it is. This is volume one. I don't have volume two at my fingertips here, but it adds probably another 2 inches. 2 inches is an exaggeration. Say another inch.
Gosh.
Um, and it
I
is
mean,
written in
isn't this
such
crazy
stilted
land when
language.
I mean, this is kind of nuts, isn't it? When you have tax policy that can be barely summarized in books that are so heavy, they become doorstops. So in this situation, then, how do we really look at how we simplify this tax system? Are there really easy prescriptions?
Unfortunately, not. But that should be a key objective of any reform should be simplicity. And not just from a statutory perspective, I showed you the statute. Certainly the statute needs to be simplified. Uh, will it ever be simple? No. I never believe that tax will be simple because society is complex,
Hmm.
and the statute will marry the complexity of society as complexity grows. Having said that, can you be mindful to simplify as best as possible? For sure. And then the related administration that goes along with that. And right now, the statute and the administration are horrifically complex.
Another thing that strikes me is I remember being in Hong Kong a number of years ago, and a number of prominent business leaders outlining to us at the time, we were a group talking about tax policy, emphasizing the genius of what's called a flat tax rate. Do you think, what is a flat tax rate, and do you think that would be a solution in Canada?
I've always been kind of negative on flat tax uh, because I wasn't convinced that you could eliminate the regressivity that a flat tax has. My opinion has changed over the years, and today I'm of the opinion that any reform should include a version of a flat personal income tax. And I think the way you do that, and devil's in the details, obviously, but is you have a big exemption, whatever that exemption is. Let's say it's $50,000. The first $50,000 of income is tax exempt. Well, that's going to eliminate a good chunk of the poor, right? And it's good. And but in order to do that, you have to take away all these crazy credits that apply, the personal exemption, childcare
Indeed.
deductions, um, um, just a whole bunch of stuff that is currently there. Multi-renovational or multi-generational renovation tax credits, silly stuff. Get rid of all that stuff and just bury it like in that high exemption amount. And I think if you model that out carefully, um, I think you could probably get there, and I'd be a real big fan because then that would add to simplicity of the statute. You could get rid of a lot of existing provisions, and you would simplify your administration, at least simplify it more than what it is today. So the short answer to your question is, I think it's worth a shot, and to look
Okay.
at it.
Well, I like your thoughts here about how to simplify the tax system. And I think what's so brilliant about that kind of vision, Kim, that you've outlined, is it grows the pie. Instead of talking about how we divide the pie, let's grow it so we can
Or
actually
redistribute
build
it.
prosperity and then look at how we enhance the quality of life in terms of everything from, building better hospitals to this and that. But in that context, I guess the real plumb line would be, well, would it bring back those files of people that you're dealing with back to Canada? We should be a magnet of prosperity a magnet for bringing people from around the world who want to build this country as entrepreneurs, not drive them away.
Oh, I totally agree. We want to attract investment capital. A lot of them are getting used to a nice lifestyle.
Yeah. So we've got to wake up as a nation because ultimately it's our level of thinking that determines our future as well as the quality of our team. So we don't want to lose good members of our team that are instrumental in building up our businesses, hiring people, moving forward our
Yeah,
standard of living. We all can win from that
no
kind of vision.
question.
So this policy, this tax policy really matters, doesn't it?
Completely. It as I lecture to my kids all the time, I've got four adult young sons, and
Hmm.
none of them have decided to follow in dad's footsteps. But
Hmm.
I always say to them, listen, guys, tax matters. It really
It
does.
really
Tax
does.
policy and economics and politics really do matter. Wake
So
up.
one of the things that intrigues me as well is the relationship between a perception of a government's credibility and the whole implementation of tax policy. And I think of the most recent economic financial statement by the government where they announced a whopping, what is it, $61.9 billion
Yeah,
deficit.
yeah.
And this is a stunning number. I have not had a chance to review it in close examination, but I suspect it's still understating the deficit. I mean, this is just a train wreck of a financial situation for the federal government alone. And this doesn't account for deficits and debt at the provincial levels of government either, or other associated entities. So, does that concern you that this deficit is this high? And what kind of impact then does that have on your clients who say, gosh, I don't know if I want to hang around a country like this that can't seem to get their books in order?
Yeah, I'll answer the first question first. Yes, it does concern me a ton. And, as we were talking offline, I'm a CPA. I mean, that's my professional background. So I'm trained
Indeed.
in accounting, and as I told you offline, you know, we had a projection of what that current deficit was going to be in April when the budget was presented, and it was roughly 40.9 billion, if I recall off the top of my head.
Yes. Yeah.
Fast forward to December, which is 8 months later, and all of a sudden that number changed by 20 billion. I can tell you, if I was in the accounting business and I audited financial statements like that,
Hmm.
I would be fired. And
Indeed.
apparently,
Yeah.
apparently the reasons they put forward was because they booked some indigenous claims and whatever,
Hmm.
and some healthcare charge or whatever. That challenges my intelligence. Any critical thinker worth their salt will not
Hmm.
accept the explanation in April, will not accept the 61.9, and will look to see
Exactly.
what other games are there. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, like you, I haven't had a chance to do that other than to just roll my eyes and say, wow, this is a train wreck.
So, Kim, it's interesting. We've talked a lot about the need to make our tax policy better in this country, to be to better serve the taxpayer, make it simpler, easier to file returns. But it's clear that tax policy matters because it relates to the health and competitiveness of our nation and our ability to have a better quality of life. And we know that the stats on Canada are pretty concerning.
Yes.
I saw a report the other day that summarized how the under 35 age group is in Canada now the most unhappiest younger age cohort among the G7 countries. And I think a lot of this just relates to the sense that the Canadian dream is dissolving before their eyes. They don't have the same opportunities as their parents. They pay a lot of tax. They are simply not in a position to build an adult life. And it's really
Yeah.
sad. So, do
Yeah.
you think this relates to dysfunctional tax policy in Canada?
I would say dysfunctional tax and economic policy,
Indeed.
and I think it was magnified and on full display during the COVID period when money was being shoveled out the door. And
Hmm.
so I don't blame them for being upset. So I think tax and economics, it's kind of like wine and cheese. They're inextricably linked.
You're right on. Well, and I think it's so foundational as well to understand the relationship of tax policy to our lives because it determines to what extent we have hope to go forward in our personal lives and also in the life of our country. And I think that that's why your points that you've outlined today, Kim, are very helpful as we think about reforming our tax system. And so, as we look to wrap things up here in our discussion, Kim, and it's been a far-reaching one, what is the advice you have for each of us? I know that you've stressed the importance of education. What
Yes.
can we do as Canadians in terms of action to move forward our lives when it comes to this area of taxes?
I think improved financial literacy is absolutely critical. The average Canadian, in my view, gets intimidated by economics and by understanding how
Hmm.
government works and taxes. But it's critical for the average Canadian to understand at least the basics of that so that they can make informed decisions at the at the ballot box. But I can
Hmm.
tell you, I advocate, like a lot of my peers have for the last 15, 20 years, and in particular the last 5 years, for tax reform because we want our country to be better for our kids, our grandkids, and to make sure that this great dream of Canada, that started with the acorn seed of Sir John A. Macdonald and all
Right
his
on.
colleagues. We want that dream to continue.
Right on. Well said, Kim. I've really appreciated our discussion today because you've challenged us to not only become better informed as citizens when it comes to tax policy, but frankly to demand reform of our tax policy system, particularly as we look to new governments and new policies. This has been a dynamite conversation, Kim, and I'm so glad we could have it.
I appreciate the invitation and glad we had it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.